to discuss the similarities and differences between what is going on in the psychedelic world, the emergence of psychedelics, and the pathway that it is following, whether it's similar or different to cannabis. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Robert Lowry, Dr. Janice Knox, Trevor Miller, and Dr. Rachel Knox. They join us from around the world, and I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But just so you have background, Dr. Rachel Knox is an MBA certified cannabinoid medicine specialist and clinical endocannabinologist. I love that word. That's a new one for me. She has a background in family integrative and functional medicine, and she founded with her family the American Cannabinoid Clinic and Advent Academy. We also have with us her mother, I believe, Dr. Janice Knox. Janice spent 35 years as an anesthesiologist, which will be interesting, so we can go into some of the other molecules that are being used in psychedelics, like ketamine, and how they've emerged from the general therapeutics. And she specialized in endocannabinology as well, studying the science and physiology and modulated effect from the cannabis plant and other plants that can be similar in their action. We also have Trevor Miller, who's a social entrepreneur and the owner of Liability Root Therapy, which is a business dedicated to healing and transformation using anti-addictive plant medicine, Ibogaine, and other psychedelic compounds. And lastly, we have Mr. Lowry, who should be Lowry. He's an
Lowry,
qualified in England and called to the British Columbia Bar. He's a very active voice in the emerging psychedelic market and industry, and serves as a board member to MAPS. He's also on SPORE. He's part of Steve Angelo's Last Prisoner project. Very, very active. So let's start with you, Robert. Can you give us some background on you and why psychedelics is interesting to you?
Well, I guess I grew up in the cannabis space, but my interest has been in the mental health space. And cannabis was a very nice segue into effectively, at least in Canada, and I'm from Vancouver, where a lot of this legalization effort started with respect to cannabis. And of course, as my colleague Trevor Miller will speak to, we have the downtown east side. So really out of the interest of solutions to deal with these strategies, cannabis and my efforts as a lawyer representing probably at one point 40% of the unlicensed dispensaries in Vancouver attempting to apply for licensing and involved with charter litigation. And most recently, I'm a member of the TheraStil Alliance and the litigation team for the Dr. Bruce Tobin Psilocybin challenge with respect to challenging the Food and Drug Regulations and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act in Canada so that medical access will be available for patients suffering from end-of-life anxiety, depression, and severe PTSD. As indicated, I'm a board advisor to MAPS Canada, and I guess through my cannabis work, I got the attention of Dr. Dennis McKenna, and I've been working with him to help establish the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. So all these experiences have really enabled me, plus, well, having practiced in corporate finance in London and New York, in addition to Canada, it's put me in a very unique position whereby I understand the charter constitutional arguments, I understand the mental health considerations, but at the same time advocating for positive change and access to these medicines and substances in my community is how I've established, I believe, a foothold, and I'm positioned to really comment today on the themes and the lessons we've learned from cannabis and really how that will be applied differently in the psychedelic space. So thank you, Saul. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Robert. Rachel, give us some background on yourself and how you see cannabis playing into psychedelics.
Absolutely, and thank you for that introduction. I do spend a lot of my time today consulting policymakers, legislators and regulators in the cannabis space. I'm newly a board member of the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, group, and this is our opportunity as clinicians to really get in there and impart some of our experience and knowledge in the form of our wisdom, to inform good policies around cannabis, specifically. My mom and I were both invited to be a part of the Oregon Psilocybin Therapy Initiative Roundtable, Healthcare Roundtable this year. And I'm very excited to announce that our initiative will be on the ballot here in Oregon in November for legalizing psilocybin. And I'm also the chair of the Oregon Cannabis Commission, right? And we've been tasked with ensuring pathways exist for our patients to have continual long-term access to the choice, right? To the choice of cannabis as medicine. And, psilocybin freedom is in a parallel path right now, right? We have an uphill battle collectively, not just healthcare professionals, but all sectors of like every industry to fight this battle, uphill battle, I will say, which is chronic disease, right? Chronic mental illness, chronic physical illness, and chronic spiritual illness. We don't talk about spirituality enough, but all of those three things can and must be addressed through whole plant medicines. And so whether we're talking about cannabis or psilocybin or maybe other botanical medicine, as an endocrinologist, my understanding is that we need to be addressing all illness at its root cause. And guess where that endocannabinoid dome exists, right? We know that cannabinoid receptors exist on the mitochondria inside every single cell inside of our bodies, right? So when we're thinking of natural medicines and having and growing in our understanding and knowledge of the pharmacology of all of these phytochemicals that are so abundant in nature, we're now learning how incredibly important these molecules have always been to our existence, right, to our survival. And over the past 100 years or so, we've had these natural substances ripped from our ecosystems. So for me, it is no wonder that we're suffering exponentially and increasingly right now. And I think in this climate right now, right, with COVID-19 and this quote unquote civil unrest, we have a duty to make sure that we are fighting for what's right. And right now it's agency, right? It's agency for everybody to choose how they heal. And so getting it right with psilocybin and psychedelics at large is going to be critically important. We've had a lot of missteps in cannabis legalization. We're working through some of those now. It's not too late, even in cannabis, to right some of those wrongs and get this industry back on track. But we have the opportunity with psychedelics to launch it correct the first time.
That's exactly right. I guess one of the things I wonder about is I'm all for freedom and for choice, but Janice, let's jump to you. A bit of background, but are these molecules, they're so powerful. They're so, to have them readily available for everyone is also a mistake. So to follow that pathway as a clinician is, what is the right pathway for psychedelics to take?
Well, I think particularly since the initiative here in Oregon is going to be on the ballot, they're proposing that the psychedelics be used under controlled conditions, with being monitored under a controlled environment, which should make a huge difference. That's different from what we had to deal with cannabis, right? We had the retail sector and we had, the medicinal sector. Well, the way it's going and the way the initiative is written here in Oregon, it sort of have left out that retail sector. So it's only going to be available to be used in a controlled environment. And I think that's a huge win, because that's one of the big mistakes that happened with cannabis. As you mentioned before, I spent 35 years as a board certified anesthesiologist. So it was my job to understand drugs and physiology. And I can tell you, as an anesthesiologist, I used ketamine as a drug, and we were very careful because of the results we would get with ketamine. to put a patient to sleep required high dosages of ketamine. And we had issues with those patients waking up. And so if you put something like this out on the street, and be it that ketamine is another psychedelic, but different from the more classical psychedelics, but yet and still on the street, we can see how issues can arise. So I'm all for it being controlled under a controlled environment with monitors. Now, being an endocannabinologist, Rachel sort of touched upon some of those things that I do. You know, I'm one of the doctors that feel it's really important that I look under the hood to understand how molecules work in the body. So I'm always looking at treating from a cellular or subcellular level at the root of the disease process. So when I'm doing cannabis, or when I got exposed to cannabis, I was curious. I wanted to know how cannabis worked. So of course I discovered the endocannabinoid system, and we quickly realized that it really wasn't about cannabis. It was about the physiology that cannabis served. And if you believe that, then you move on to other natural things that manipulates that physiology. One of the things that manipulate that physiology as well are the psychedelics. Not just ketamine, but other psychedelics. And Rachel mentioned the endocannabinoid OM. And what that is, it's a bigger lipid messenger system that the endocannabinoid system happens to be a part of. So there's other receptors and other enzyme systems that are going on. And as you look at that, you see the role of the receptor systems that the hallucinogenics or the psychedelics work on. We know which receptors that they work on. We know where ketamine works. We know where psilocybin works. We know where, kava works. We know where all of these different things work, which make it really important that we do it correctly. And I do think it's really important for clinicians of all types to get involved to help make this go the right direction. Because if we leave it up to pharmaceutical companies or big business, it will go in the wrong direction again. So we all do need to get it right. And it's going to come from people who really understand how these products work. We're not going to let pharmaceutical companies tell us this is what you use because this is what you use. We need to understand and then help apply this knowledge clinically and safely. So I'm hoping that psilocybin, not just psilocybin, but all the psychedelics do not go in the same direction that cannabis, and we're in a mess with cannabis right now, but as Rachel suggested, it's not too late to do it right.
So Trevor, you're right, Janice, 100% right. We can learn a lot and hopefully fix some of the mistakes that were made. But Trevor, you've got a background both in cannabis and Ibogaine, other botanicals. Little bit of background about yourself and how you see the similarities or differences.
First, a bit of a heads up. We had a power outage right before we started here. So this phone may die eventually as well. If it does, I'll phone in on my partner's phone. In around 2011, 2001, I started looking for different ways to help a neighborhood that we've got here in Vancouver called the Downtown East Side. And that basically turned into about a 10-year networking and researching project until in 2009, Ibogaine came on the radar as a way to potentially help. For people that don't know, because it's a bit of a kind of the dark horse of the psychedelic world, it is a medicine that comes from a shrub in Africa called the Iboga plant, and it's been used ceremonially for centuries there. And in the 1960s, it was discovered that it has these very powerful anti-addictive properties, specifically around opioid addiction. It helps people get through opioid withdrawals quickly and relatively painlessly compared to having to do a conventional detox. And through my work there, I was invited to be a board member and chair of the board for MAPS Canada, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And we've recently created an organization called the Canadian Psychedelic Association, and it really was formed around these questions in particular. There was a group of 30 of us that met last year at a retreat specifically oriented towards all this money starting to come into our psychedelic space now. What can we do to shepherd that in a good direction? Is that at all possible? So the CPA really grew out of that. I wrote a piece called "Why Psychedelics Are Not the Next Cannabis" that you can find, the Psychedelic Times published it. And the first thing I said is, and it was really speaking to the public markets really, is cannabis isn't even really the next cannabis. A lot of the speculative value that was in these stocks at the get-go, as time has gone on and kind of the rubbers met the road, a lot of these companies no longer kind of have the same kind of share value as before. But that piece is really about, I think that the word psychedelic, it comes from mind or soul manifesting. And then the word entrepreneur means to undertake something. So I think psychedelic entrepreneurship is, how do you manifest your soul into an undertaking? And in order to do that, you really have to move out of the competitive paradigm. You have to take some of the lessons that these psychedelic medicines offer, like, wow, we're actually all one with each other. So if you're in competition with somebody else, you're actually in competition with yourself. So you need to work through that kind of thing. So I think the beautiful potential here with psychedelics and cannabis is we have the potential to usher in a new paradigm, a new way of doing business. I think that's the invitation these plants are making for us right now. So are we going to take that invitation and run with it? And I think everything the speakers before me have said so far rings so true. Like, how do we get this right this time? Cannabis, we missed the mark a little bit. Can we fix it? I think we can fix that as well. And then what do we do moving forward? I think we need to move out of this cutthroat way of doing business. Instead, look at how can we create alliances that actually have the potential to save the world, is what I'm focused on. And on the regulatory standpoint, I think it's true. We do need regulations that honor the proper way of using these medicines. And then at the same time, I'm in Vancouver, which is kind of the home of harm reduction strategies as well, is people are going to do these on their own anyway. For some people, a therapist's office is just as foreign as a jungle in Peru. So how can we educate people that are going to do these medicines on their own anyway? Prohibition has never worked. How do we decriminalize? I'm behind the decriminalization at the federal level. We've got a federal e-petition in Canada going right now, decriminalizenature.ca. So yes, we need to look at proper regulations, and nobody should be going to jail or even feel the threat of jail for exploring these things that grow out of the ground.
That's a beautiful segue to my first question to Rob, actually. Can you outline the social and political elements that led to the criminalization of psychedelics? And was it cannabis's fault?
That's a great question, and I think it really ties into the issues that have bubbled to the surface over the last month, with a number of issues involving equality and inequality. And the cannabis tradition in Canada, which certainly led into the psychedelic point of your question, but it all had to do with race in Canada. In the West Coast, we had opium and cannabis, and the opium and the cannabis, Prime Minister Mackenzie King attributed to Asians. And it was the Asian Exclusion Acts, and pointing to effectively these xenophobic ideals, which were kind of pounded into the Canadian mainstay. I mean, you had Emily Murphy, who was a magistrate, writing as Janie Canuck, and her publication, The Black Candle, was effectively written on behalf of how we need to safeguard white society and protect from these foreign invaders, and using drugs to demonize that. And we see that tradition playing on to the States with the Black, Hispanic, and Mexican cultures being demonized. But with psychedelics, to jump forward, we're looking mainly at, I mean, this was legal in Canada in the 50s with Humphrey Osmond, but it really was the 70s when Richard Nixon basically declared Timothy Leary and the counterculture movement, he declared it as basically public enemy number one. To which Timothy Leary responded, well, then I have America surrounded. And effectively, it was to tie the counterculture and the anti-Vietnam and the anti-war and the civil rights movement and those sentiments by tying in counterculture and drugs and these harms was a real impetus for Richard Nixon to bring in the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, which all of the world is under the brunt of this legislation. And it's a large...
One sec, Rob. Everybody can see my face right now. Can you pin Rob's face? Because he's much better looking than I am.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
I have significantly more hair.
Yes.
But in any event, yes, it's really been born out of unfair, prejudicial circumstances, which, along with everything that we have witnessed recently, this is part of what we have to go back and address in order to move forward. So again, the safety, the efficacy, the social utility, all of these factors that benefit the understanding and lead to the necessity for further engagement have all been completely, I guess, bastardized, for lack of a better word, because of unassociated and unconnected issues sought to demonize these substances. And well, we're certainly moving out of that, but in order to move forward, we have to address the past.
The Canadian government was sued over 300 times for a bad cannabis policy. Do you see the same pathway following, Robert, in Canada? Is this going to become as wide an issue as cannabis was?
Well, that's a very good point. In all of this, we have the issue of product liability, and that really highlights the difference between producing or sourcing medicine for yourself for medical purposes, which is very distinct from a substance being produced or made available for commercial purposes. And well, yes, what we've seen with cannabis and the lawsuits and these problems, and effectively it's a cautionary tale for better address it with psychedelics, because unlike cannabis, I mean, cannabis is a benevolent accepting substance by comparison to if you get your dosage wrong with psychedelics. With all due respect, I think more things can go wrong with psychedelics if their use is done without setting an intention. Whereas cannabis, again, if we're worried about people driving with cannabis, man, you should be a lot more concerned about driving on some of these other substances. But again, that's not to say, though, in the right circumstance and the right application, there's a time and a place for these. And that's the real issue is that the authorities have really dictated complete falsehoods with respect to time, place, and suitability for engaging with these substances.
So let me jump to the doctors. From a therapeutic perspective, this is very exciting for mental health, possibly for pain, addiction. Where do we have to be careful? Robert mentioned dosage, set and setting. Does criminalization or decriminalization automatically lead to legalization? Let's start with you, Janice. You've got the most experience among us with patients.
Well, I think Robert was correct on several places. Number one, I think dosing is really, really super important. And when you compare cannabis to the psychedelics, we're really talking about the effects THC has, correct? Because THC is the only one that has those intoxicating effects. Now, THC works on CB1 and CB2 receptors, which the psychedelics do not. And that's a huge difference, number one. The cannabis plant itself has many, many components that work together in an entourage effect, so it sort of can mitigate some of those effects of the THC. So far, we have identified, particularly in psilocybin, psilocin, and psilocybin as the main ingredients, but it also has an entourage effect that we do not yet know much about. Now, the difference is THC will also work on that same receptor that the hallucinogenics or the psychedelics work on, and those are serotonin receptors. It's called the 5-HT2A receptor. and that receptor is responsible for the hallucinations. So THC is also a psychedelic, but to get that very mystical effect, you need super high doses of THC, whereas with the psychedelics, you need low to moderate doses. You go over that, and you're going to get into issues that Robert was talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons in Oregon they're wanting to have more controlled environment for people to use it, particularly as a medicine. Yes, people are going to use it anyway, but to get the medicinal effects we want, certain things have to be in place, a controlled environment, soothing environment, to sort of change, that mindset. We use the psychedelics for, various diseases, PTSD, end-of-life depression with cancer patients, or treatment-resistant depression, anxiety disorders, and even autism. But to get those effects, researchers are saying that you need to reach that mystical zone to get the effects that you want to get from those patients. And it has to be in a set environment to have the best effects. So I think it's really important that we do understand how cannabis and both the psychedelics are the same, but yet different, and how do we regulate the proper use so we get the effects that we want. And they're totally two different animals, even though they may cross over in some of the end results.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, decriminalization does not mean legalization, but legalization needs to happen with decriminalization so that we can mitigate risk, right? We want to lead with education. We want to lead with safeguards in place. And, legalizing into a research model, if you will, which is exactly what Oregon and this initiative are purporting to do with legalization, allows us to do that. And I would suggest to states that have not legalized cannabis yet to do it in the same way. Legalize into a model that is a controlled system so that we can do the necessary data mining, right? Meaning that we're going to have to start tracking. We can anonymize data, but we need to track from seed to outcome. We need to have a tracking system across the entire supply and demand network, not just this, horizontal supply chain. We need to know how people are experiencing these substances such that we can continuously process, improve our regulations, how we're educating, how we're consulting, and really get a command over these processes, the rules and regulations, such that we're always creating a better space. And, if ever we want to extend access to folks outside of a clinical setting, I'm not sure if we will. I think data and experience will inform us how we should, if we should do that. You can expand it, right? Extend access, again, in a controlled and measured way. You can be very pragmatic about that. Unfortunately, we were not pragmatic about adult use legalization with respect to cannabis, and we're learning the hard way. And I know we're going to dig more into that a little bit, so I'll yield for now.
Well, I wanted to ask you on top of that, does that include a framework that allows for the testing of microdosing and regular dosing as opposed to heroic once off, maybe twice off? Is that allowed within that framework that you're looking at?
It should be. So in Oregon, our initiative is just that, right? It's legislative concept, it's statutory. So when it comes down to creating those rules and regulations, which will happen over a 2-year period, because we're not looking, we won't see access until around 2023, because the time needs to be, it needs to be had so that the right people can come to the table and help inform those rules and regulations. And I would hope that that is a critical component to that. I mean, this is a living research project. Again, we've missed the boat in cannabis, right? Cannabis legalized in California in 1996. That's over 20 years worth of data that we missed out on, right? So again, in a controlled setting, we should be collecting data on a variety of doses, a variety of settings even, right? I don't think that we need to fear, the experiences that our consumers, right, our patients might experience, which means we have to take the time in this 2-year period, in Oregon at least, to ensure we're being very practical about the regulations around setting and intention, making sure the folks that will be overseeing and administering have the right amount of education, right? Nobody should be entering into this process without those safeguards in place, right? So having a controlled system over how it's grown, what it's processed into, right, form factor, and how it's administered. Much care and attention has to be placed into that system before we press go.
Yeah,
and I want to add just a little bit there, is that when we have that control system, I think it'll be easier to collect the data so that we can understand dosing, timing of dosing, how much needs to be used. Right now we know psilocybin, at least in high doses, can cause some permanent changes to the brain. But it comes with taking high doses. You have that 4 to 6 hour window where patients are feeling sort of out of whack, and versus a microdosing where they're taking smaller doses just to avoid that 4 to 6 hour feeling and to get the same result. But we don't know how accurate any of those reports are. But collecting the information will allow us to create better products and better services.
Trevor, I wanted to jump to you and talk about the market excitement around psychedelics. There's been a huge increase, one of the top 10 trending topics in Google right now. So there's a huge amount of people looking for information. One of the things in the Canadian market that drove the change in policy was to drive out the black market. This is going to be a little bit different. So can you give us some of the history around that part of the cannabis and psychedelic world, and how will the current market really play out around this?
I'm going to keep my video off just to save my battery here. It's an interesting question because on one hand, we need money. We need people coming in with their pocketbooks to fund everything that needs to happen to move this space forward. At the same time, I'm kind of dubious of, a lot of the psychedelic offerings that I've seen so far. I just don't see a lot of meat on the bone. These products are incredibly inexpensive to produce, so you're not going to make a lot of money on the product itself. And in speaking of cannabis, if the goal in Canada was to legalize to get rid of the black market, that has failed miserably because the government produces crappy weed, we're discovering, and they package it horribly, and it's a waste of plastic. And it's really, we've gone from here in Vancouver, I used to say we're in the wild west of weed here in Vancouver, where for the last 10 or 15 years, we have these beautiful, independent, unique cannabis shops owned by people who really, really cared about the space and where the plant came from and could tell you the story of the lineage of the plant and who grew it first and who came up with the strain. And it was awesome. And post-legalization, we've got nothing like that. They've shut down all of the people who cared, and Rob can speak more to that because he defended a lot of these original growers and trying to maintain that sense of independence. And unfortunately, that lawsuit failed. So now we've got these kind of, Apple Genius Store-esque pot shops where they just feel sterile. Nobody really knows what they're talking about, and they sell shitty weed, quite frankly. So the underground market is still flourishing. If you want good pot in Canada, you go to your old dealer. They can still make that happen. So, these are all the things that need to be considered. I think as far as legalization of these plants in particular, and there's different considerations for molecules, but the legalization of plants should be similar to agriculture products, shouldn't they? You know, as long as you get what you pay for what you asked for. There's no mold on it. Things have been, you know, it's been, if you want to buy the organic stuff, you go to the organic guy. If you want to buy local, you go to the local guy. And then there's the monoculture guys as well, which serve a purpose as well. So where can we find this middle road? I'm all about the middle road lately. Is, you know, let's take the brilliant insights that we've had through the agriculture revolution, and we know how to grow things on scale to feed the planet now. And how do we take the lessons that the organic growers know as well, and where do we find that middle road is what I'm after.
Well, can I speak to some of this? Because this is right up my alley in my experience and what I dealt with. And effectively, yes, Dr. Rachel Knox highlighted the most important point, that this whole cannabis legalization is not legalization. It literally was an inside job done by a number of folks within the Liberal Party who brought a number of hedge funds to the table. And this was effectively their mousetrap that was designed to work for them. Well, thank God for the black market, because it's the only thing that has kept the legal market honest. And the point that I want to illustrate for everybody, if you don't get this right with, like, put it this way, with cannabis, it was 37 cents a pound in 1935, the year before the Marijuana Stamp Act. I'm sure they were not cultivating THC out of the cannabis or the hemp in those days, but in any event, adjust for inflation, and we have pricing based on 90 years of prohibition black market pricing. If this model was done with decriminalization first, we would have moved from the black market gangsterism down the curve to where public health, public safety policies would reflect the price. However, Canada, we pushed things back up the curve to where we have corporate gangsterism. Okay, and ultimately this corporate gangsterism in the context of psychedelics, and this is why I love being a lawyer in the space, is that you're competing with a $45 bag of mushrooms. So the legal market, the flashy public markets, they better get this right, because if they don't, well, folks are gonna know where to get it, and we're gonna end up with what we have in legal cannabis in Canada, which is the tale of two cities, one legal, one illegal. And if we want to achieve the goals and the endeavors that, you know, my colleagues today have all spoken up about, it's really going to be a question of ensuring that the rules and the game is established before everybody starts playing. And especially when it comes to accessing something we should never have been denied in the first place.
I agree. The question I have at the back of my mind is, will the mushroom, particularly psilocybin market, follow the illegal cannabis market, where we're going into extracting mushrooms, edible mushroom formulas, microdosing?
You're already seeing it in the black market, Saul, right? All of this stuff isn't new. It's just new to you, is sort of how I look at it. Or not you to you, I mean, because you know what you're doing, but it's new to the Michael Pollan culture, which are just getting introduced to psychedelics and are understanding their footing. But to, you know, more important to your point, you know, Canada, we're probably going to see first legally. I mean, there's only one company that can produce GMP lab-produced psilocybin, and that is Psygen Incorporated. Right? And then Canada, because they like to do everything, you know, controlled and done with respect to medical precision. Well, you're probably going to see synthetic GMP psilocybin is what will be made available first for lab, but I don't agree that will work, because look at the lesson in cannabis, right? Marinol, Sativex, and is it Nabalone, the third synthetic, and none of it comes anywhere close to the effectiveness of full spectrum natural biological cannabis. So again, we need to come up with a system that works, not a system that works for a bunch of rich white guys that are gonna basically pump and dump something beautiful into the ground and cash out and leave us with the mess to clean up. And so I really think you have to be extra vigilant now and literally be aware of who are the people that said, follow us to the, the promised land with cannabis, and well, make sure that they don't lead us down that path again when it comes to these medicines. It's a cautionary tale.
And we're seeing a lot of that. Like you said, the deals are driven by bankers, not by doctors, not by patients. And I guess that's one of the things to be most wary of. It might look good on a deck and it might seem impressive, but I think with cannabis as well, when we're patient-centric, the system works. When you take the patient out of it, like they have in Israel, you get a messed up system, and that's ultimately what we need to sort of get right, in my opinion, around this. And if it's the patient and the patient is suffering, then me as a regulator or me as a doctor, I want to do everything I can to help that patient. And if that means using an illicit, illegal substance, in some cases, there might be a call for that. And the regulator has to recognize that and trust in the certification that they've given to doctors and to pharmacists and people in the supply chain. And Trevor, it's one of the questions that I have. You dealt in Ibogaine. How, as a researcher, do I get Ibogaine today? I know I can get synthetic psilocybin, but what do you do with the supply chain around these molecules?
Yeah, it's tough. The one GMP, so pharmaceutical grade producer of Ibogaine, was Remagen. That was the name of the product. The company was Phytostan Nutraceuticals, and they unfortunately got pushed out of Canada, where they were operating about 3 or 4 years ago now, and it's been really tough to get pharmaceutical grade Ibogaine ever since. I know Rob mentioned Psygen, and there is another corporation, Salvation Botanicals, who's owned by Numinous now. They're all potentially working towards GMP Ibogaine. I know a guy in South Africa who is very close. I think he's maybe $100,000 away from being able to produce a GMP product. So yeah, really, there isn't any is the short answer, and I'm working on multiple fronts to make sure that there is at some point.
So, like Rachel and Janice, how do you go about a clinical test without a clinical supply chain? You're effectively dealing in an illegal substance that is currently criminal. How do you approach that as a doctor?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that question. This has been my rallying cry in cannabis this whole time, and it extends to psychedelics and anything else under the sun. It is a clinician's due diligence to understand without bias the pharmacology of a substance that a patient might put in their body and the physiology that substance works on. It is our job, whether that product is legal or illegal. It is our duty to that patient to serve them, again, impartially, such that we're providing them with the best and most informed care. Just because something is illegal, right, by legal definition, arbitrary definition, doesn't make that inherently harmful, and vice versa. Just because it's legal and FDA approved doesn't make it healthful. Right? So it is really the clinician's job, doctors, nurses, chiropractors, naturopaths, etc. I love that word agency, I'm going to use it again, to reclaim our own agency. You hit the nail on the head, or I don't know, that might have been Robert, who said that people need to trust us. We've gone through the education. We have the certifications. You've entrusted us with everything else. You can trust us now, but you have to give us the freedom to have those conversations. When we have the big business of medicine censoring healthcare professionals, we know that something is out of alignment, something is wrong. And healthcare professionals need to no longer acquiesce to that illusory thumb that is big pharma, that is big business in medicine, and big insurance. Like, we need to stand up for our own rights so that we can stand up for the rights of our patients.
And big food too. And I want to add, that's the importance of clinicians understanding the physiology and the pharmacology behind these products. Everything the FDA approves usually have some what we call off-label use. So we can use things off-label if we can explain why and how we're using it. So it's imperative to me that clinicians of all ilks get involved at this level so that we direct how these products are used. The other thing that's really important, I can tell you as a clinician, there's times when I have patients when I think one of the psychedelics is better for that patient than the cannabis product. And I feel I should be able to use that product if I think it's important. The other thing that's come about is that just understanding cannabis and the physiology behind the cannabis now has helped us to connect that whole patient. So asking about their spirituality, asking about, you know, their mental stats, all those things need to be looked at together to move a patient towards total wellness. We cannot do one without the other. And we can only do that if providers get on board with understanding what the hallucinogenics are about. And, you know, and it's just not like a fungus. I mean, it's from toad venom or wasp venom. There's all kinds of different avenues we can get these products from, but how do we use them safely? And to do that, we need to write our own narrative. No longer can we allow big pharma, big food, big business, big insurance to write our narrative of how we treat patients. And that's really important. If I have a patient with an end-of-life cancer and they need their depression treated, I will recommend psilocybin to them. And I will tell them how to take their psilocybin in addition to a cannabis therapy or their chemotherapy that they're taking. That should be my right, and that should be their right to use it if that's what they want to use.
And when synthetic psilocybin is available, will you be recommending that or moving to still in the plant-based whole plant medicine side? At what point, you know, do you know where that difference comes in? I guess it's efficacy there.
You know,
I will tell you that we will always promote the natural products over synthetic products. Synthetics are coming, so we're not going to get away from that. But as clinicians, I'm going to always promote that natural product first.
Yeah, I echo those sentiments. I think that though, where we might see synthetics reigning supreme is in the hospital setting, in the acute setting. And I think that might even be true for cannabinoids, right? There might be a place in that acute setting under controlled, like extremely controlled measures. We might see the use of the monomolecular synthetic drugs, cannabinoids, psychedelics, et cetera. And I think that might be the only appropriate place for those.
I think
but that's what's knowing that you don't have the best medicine when you're using an isolate, because even the psychedelics have their entourage effect, and that's always going to be the best medicine. So they're not getting the best medicine in a hospital if they're using that isolate of any form.
They're not, patients aren't getting the best food. They're not getting the best care in those settings. Anyways, I think our conventional system is going to be a hard needle to move. But I do see the rise of an alternative system to it.
I think there's some good news on the
That's us. You're on your phone.
Change to a different do you want to go on
we're really close to being for having medicine that we can test side by side. Like, we're 60 years behind on the research here. Let's find out
qualify that though, Trevor. Numinous is the first public company. There's countless number of black market
right, of course
operating under an R&D license doing just that, which highlights again the necessity of understanding what actually is permissible, what is legal, and what is possible. And the theme that I've always seen is for every legal application, there's maybe 5 to 10 better in the illicit market, which is not able to come to market due to arbitrary conditions and requirements. But slowly over time, those will erode.
And in defense of the synthetic, and like I say, I'm all about the middle road these days. When psilocybin was first synthesized, it was brought to Maria Sabina in Mexico, one of the earliest known curanderos of the mushroom. And when she took it, she said, yes, this is Los Niños. So she really did feel the spirit of the mushroom, even in the synthetic. But it's that entourage effect. What else is being cut out? That's what's the really interesting prospect in being able to legally research these things now.
And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of these substances are illegal. We didn't really talk about the paper lobby, the forestry lobby, the little bit about the pharma lobby, the synthetics lobby. We didn't bring up Harry Anslinger, the Hearst dynasty. Effectively, all these people that went out of their way, Andrew Mellon, all these industrialists went out of their way to basically take what Scientific America deemed the billion-dollar crop in the 1930s and sidelined it with the chemical synthetics. And, effectively big pharma came in because, look, you don't need to take 2 of these and call me in the morning approach with the plant medicines and the psychedelics, as we've seen with the recent research out of Johns Hopkins and the other leading institutions. So again, this is completely and totally disruptive to the existing system. And out of that, I think we're going to see some wonderful direction and development.
And there is some protocol to follow on this. The current psychedelics or the antipsychotics or antidepressants that are in use today, they have been, sort of derived from a natural product like atropine. And those products where they work, they just do not work as well. And patients are getting very little relief from those antipsychotics and antidepressants that are synthetics, but built off that platform of atropine. Some of the tricyclics are built off the platform of natural amphetamines. Again, patients are failing these therapies because of their nature. Something is missing. But when you give that patient back something as natural as some of the hallucinogenics, psilocybin or kava, or what's the next one? Ayahuasca. Those patients are getting better relief from those products for that reason, because they do have that entourage effect in addition to their main component.
So it leads me to one of the questions, which is how do we create incentives to investors around intellectual property frameworks? Since it's hard to patent existing nature and therapies that have been around for a very long time. So, we spoke a little bit about where the industry is going, and there is a lot of excitement and a lot of money flowing into this. Rob, where do you see the incentives coming in the intellectual property in order to create a business framework that is also, meets the times?
Thank you. Great question. Well, that's what you have to look at. What are companies able to bring to market now? And so ancillary products like apps or virtual reality or any sort of other ancillary product which complements or assists or enhances and enables the further study. I mean, those are good to go now in terms of investment opportunities. However, anything that's involved around the supplement itself, well, again, unless it's a new or a novel compound, psychedelics have been around for ages. I mean, mescaline was synthesized as far back as 1900s by Hefter. So effectively, we have to look at who are the people involved, what is the research backed on, and at the end of a clinical, or various stages of clinical trials, the product at the end has to meet the twin pillars of safety and efficacy. So ultimately, your return on investment requires that at the end of the research, there's actually a commodity or a patentable product and a market demand for that product which line up. And so you're seeing companies like Compass really build what is termed as a patent portfolio, meaning that they hope they control access and movement and controls around it, which in a way may or may not work, because ultimately, can they enforce what they're trying to patent? And, let's just take a non-psychedelic example, such as Dyson vacuums. Well, for every component, Dyson has 6 patents. Why? Because if one fails, he can sue Hoover on the other 5, right? And that's one of the reasons Dyson has survived. He's had to sue Hoover for like 30 years because they keep ripping off the tech. And so ultimately, all the psychedelic companies should take a page from that, great, you may be able to come up with new and novel products, but can you prevent your neighbor or another company or someone acting in another jurisdiction that doesn't even recognize IP from taking your idea and running with it? So that's why we need to look at what are the better ways of doing this. And I think it was Graham Boyd, who I listened to a few weeks ago, in his involvement with VAP. And so if you're going to donate a significant amount of money and make a psychedelic investment, well, yes, you can look at private investment, but at the same time, would it make more sense to put that $1 million or capital into something being managed and facilitated by either MAPS or the Hefter Institute or the Beckley Foundation? Why? Because these are the folks that already know what clinical trials and the market and the demand and the relationship with the regulators and the relationship with the main stakeholders. So ultimately, there's a lot of opportunity, but it's what is your intention? And is it either to make a profit and build off the industry, which fair enough, that's what the investment industry does, or is it to create something that is sustainable and will work long time with the greatest public safety and public health benefit? And unfortunately, Health Canada has been anything but healthy for Canadians. And I'm hoping that, again, they will look at modifying and adjusting this, but it is so disruptive. And I can't stress enough how disruptive these medicines and technologies are, that really it's going to create greater winners and losers than we saw in cannabis. But we have the potential to be all winners if we do this right.
Yeah, I think the point is we have the chance to invent a new paradigm of doing business here. Like, do we really need to invest in order to make a few extra bucks? Or, as I've been coaching some of these psychedelic ventures, our mission should be healing ourselves out of business. Yes. Like, that's the world I want to live in, is like I'm an expert at getting people from -10 to 0 using plant medicines. And you can, but there is a 0 to +10. But let's get everybody to 0. And that's the world that I want to live in. Like, let's heal ourselves out of business. That potential is there.
There is no place for brutal capitalism in plant medicine. None. There is no place for in cannabis, and we're seeing what's going wrong with brutal capitalism entering into the industry. There's no place for it in psilocybin legalization and psychedelic legalization at large. I think we need to move absolutely now into conscious capitalism with the eye to moving even beyond capitalism. I completely agree, Trevor. And I think right now we need to put some safeguards in place, right? I mean, even in cannabis, talk about lessons learned. Maybe big corporations should not be able to invest any more than, let's say, 10% in any. We have to be very deliberate about how we structure these regulations. And somebody mentioned before, Rob, might have been you, like, or Trevor, I can't remember which one said it because it's coming from different sides of the screen. Right, this was medicine, right? That was normal and natural to us, not just us in general, but to people of color, to indigenous people. And like cannabis, if we are not using the economy of these substances to restore some justice or restore community, restore some wealth to these populations, again, we've completely missed the mark. So this is my opinion, and it's one that I speak to loudly now, especially in that cannabis space. We need to be reinvesting what is earned through these legalization processes back into the communities that have been most harmed by it being ripped away from them, and into research. Those must be the top priorities in any legalization framework of any of these plants that have been criminalized, right, at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people, period. Like, we have to do it that way, or else we've missed the mark.
And that's really what I've been thinking about, trying to find a unique and a better working business model since about 2005, when I was aiming to help this neighborhood that I'm walking in right now. I printed a bunch of t-shirts, and I'm like, I'm going to use the profits of these t-shirts to try and help the downtown east side. And then I sold a couple t-shirts. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do with the money, even if I make it. So I spent the next 20 years figuring out how I could spend money if people did give me money. And these medicines are a great way to spend money without corrupting your soul in the meantime. And Liberty Root is going through a revitalization right now, where we're going to be using all of these plant medicines in a legal way as the legalities work themselves out. But imagine a corporation where the only share is one share owned by an individual. So me as the owner will own one share in Liberty Root. The person that cleans the toilets for me will own one share in Liberty Root. And we will all work together. So there's, like I say, there's a real potential to do a new kind of paradigm here. That's the invitation these plants are making to us, is how do we work more in alignment with life itself and what life is asking us to work in to be harmonious and healthy human beings.
Great. There are teachers. I always say this, the endocannabinoid system and endocannabinoid dome, its network demonstrates to us how we should be conducting business. It's collaborative, it's reciprocal, it's synergistic, right? That's how we should be conducting life. These plants and our physiology and the way they work together are demonstrating to us how to move through this life. And we need to start imitating it for our own benefit.
But we also haven't touched on the fact that freedom of consciousness, right? What do I need a medical need, or so on and so forth? I should be able to access these plants, these medicines on terms that make sense. And in fact, it's why I practice law the way I do, because I believe that we all need the relationship, a symbiotic relationship with plant medicines, because only through which will we truly understand ourselves, and will we be in a position to effectively and truly understand these medicines. I mean, I represent a lot of environmental activists, and I serve on a board with Rex Weiler, who founded Greenpeace. And I mean, Greenpeace started out of the Quaker tradition of bearing witness. And I'm fairly comfortable and confident that my colleagues on this call have all been bearing witness with respect to their profession, their expertise, and learning about these substances, their impacts, and coming back and educating and informing and bearing witness. And I think that's the call and the challenge that I will put out to everyone is, if you're going to be involved in this space and you're going to utilize these medicines and you're going to pursue your own freedom of consciousness, well, you need to lead by example and bear witness.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, Robert. I think there needs to be a distinction made once and for all between wellness and health and medicine, medical, right? We've gotten used to relegating healthcare to something synonymous with medical care. Medical care happens in a clinic or a hospital. Healthcare should be happening everywhere else, right? Wellness, right? Your consciousness is a function of your health and wellness.
Yes.
Right? Your agency's function of your health and wellness. If we can just shift the paradigm of our very understanding of what wellness and what health is, we'll recognize that it's all encompassing. And each and every one of us has the birthright to accessing health and wellness for ourselves by all means that have been given to us naturally, right? Nobody owns any of this. My mom's always talking about these arbitrary lines that delineate countries and states, et cetera. It's all arbitrary. And we've sort of passively allowed it to happen to us and to nature. And here is a moment in time where we can begin to get this right. If it's with the psychedelic movement, if it's with psilocybin legalization specifically, gosh, I've been begging people to get cannabis right so that it can be the next model for all other industries if we can just get it right. I think we do have that opportunity right now. I think the world is chaotic enough right now that a few of us who have the capacity to imagine it differently get together and execute. I really do. I'm very hopeful.
I so echo that sentiment. I think we are, I feel as though we're in like the biblical rapture times where half of the people have become extremely fear-based and kind of isolated, and the other half of us is like, wow, what opportunity to bring about all the things we've been working on for the last 20 years. So I think if we all just feel that and move forward with faith that we can make a better world, we're gonna nail it.
Well, you know, let me add this. What's interesting about the COVID, what I call the apocalypse, is that everybody had to sort of stay home, right? But look how nature cleaned itself when people were home. The environment changed. Animals came out again. You know, the skies cleared. You know, that's the rule of nature. That's the law of the universe. It will heal itself if we get out of the way. And all of these things, for me, I see the silver lining in the cloud. If we pay attention, it's telling us what we need to do to have a better environment, you know, to reconnect with families, you know, to spiritually eat together, you know, play together. I mean, we have been forced to do what's more natural to us. To feel natural, the natural, which is so weird. But if you think about the laws of nature and you think about the physiology, different patterns throughout, you can see the pattern. And once again, it's speaking to us. We just have to listen. And I do echo Dr. Rachel when she says, those of us who see it and can feel it are the ones who need to step forward and make sure it continues. Because we should be thinking about nature's laws. We should be thinking about wellness instead of illness. We should tell everybody to use these certain natural things to remain well. Do not wait until you get sick to think about using these things. Why are you going to wait till you get sick? So wellness should be what all of us are aimed for. That should be our goal. And wellness encompasses many things: our physical health, our mental health, social health, relationships, environmental health. All of those point to wellness, spiritual health. So if we pay attention to the universe, it's telling us. Do we hear it?
I don't think we do. One of the things that's driven me to build Canatech and now Psytech is inclusivity, is, you know, making sure that the right people are there in the right room, whether it's from the legal, the banking, the regulatory, the science, the patient side. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is infighting often in this industry. And I think, Rachel, you said this industry is so big, it is so impactful. We can make such a difference if we just all work together. So I want to just tell everyone about our upcoming webinar that we have on July 15th, which is Psychedelic Assisted Psychotherapy for Eating Disorders. You can find more information about that on our site. But just before we wrap up, you've been with us for over an hour and it's been an incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed it. One takeaway: how can people get involved? What can they be doing in order to help move this movement forward? And it really is a movement and a revolution. So how can people get involved where they are, or internationally in places like Canada, Israel, Jamaica, that are leading at least some of the regulatory reform? Rachel, let's start with you.
We need to talk about it. And somebody had asked in the questions, like, how do we reduce the stigma? We need to be leading with the historical context, as well as what we know scientifically, in my opinion, and start talking about those things as loudly as is possible. You know, we need to do the good work simultaneously to helping usher in a new way of thinking in the general population. It's really hard to do both. I think we've witnessed that with cannabis. It's been an uphill battle because it's taken a long time to get people to wrap their mind around the fact that Cannabis is not a drug of abuse, right? And so while the folks who are there, who are awake, who are in tune, are getting our hands wet, legalizing, creating initiatives, organizing, starting companies, right? Preparing for this new wave, I think we do need to simultaneously educate the public so that they can have conversations. Listen, historical context matters. When people recognize that they've been lied to, they get really mad. When people recognize they've been deprived of, in some cases, life-saving information, they get supercharged. And when you couple that with the scientific facts around the pharmacology and the physiology that those substances work on, people begin to think to a different tune. And we need more people having positive conversations around it, for their benefit, but also so that they don't continue to be a barrier to progress. So I'm all about education, leading with education. The more people we have sounding off on the potential and the benefit and the freedom that we can all achieve, consciously and otherwise through this legalization effort, I think we will move the needle.
Robert?
Well, yes, a lot of good points and thoughts. I mean, there's enough room for everybody on this team. And I think folks need to realize no one's going to come up to you and say, hey, get in the game. It's really up to you to figure out what's important to you and what role do you want to play in this space. And that requires taking some initiative to understand who are some of the leading organizations, what are the not-for-profits, what are the groups in your area, who are the national groups representing interests. And believe me, from the experience that I have from serving on a number of advisory boards and groups and endeavors, it's all hands on deck, right? There's more than enough room, and it's a great opportunity that if you're young, and especially at this time when help is needed, this really is a time to step up. So I would invite and encourage anyone who's listening, figure out what is important to you and what role do you want to play in bringing that to fruition, and connect with the other like minds that are moving in that direction. And I think you'll find that that'll be a great way to immerse yourself in a space that is continually changing, adapting, evolving, and growing. And if you stay on top of that, well, those developments will only be transferable to your life and the way you want to live it. So I'd say jump in, come on in, the water's fine.
The water's fine.
Speaking of jumping in, yeah, I better go next because I just got my 20-minute or 20% warning. Oh, there we go. Speaking of jumping in, I just got my warning that my battery's almost dead here. So, yeah, I think an important thing is to everybody that wants to be involved to make sure they're doing their own work. And if you ask what does that mean, then you need to really dig in and do your own work. But it essentially means are you being healed by these medicines? Have you started your own healing journey? Have you uncovered your traumas that keep getting triggered? Have you worked towards healing those? So I think we all need to take responsibility and do our own work. And then, yes, become part of the communities. There's the mycelial network is active. There are so many beautiful communities working together to bring about the fruition of this space now. The psychedelicAssociation.net is the Canadian Psychedelic Association website. That's a community. The MAPS community, MAPS Canada community, you can find those online. Just start having the conversations about how these medicines are impacting you. I've got my 10% warning now, so if I fall away, I'm falling away. I got a beautiful power outage that's still underway here right now, but it's about that middle road. Thankfully, we've got the Wi-Fi and power on the phone as well. Anyway, I'm incredibly optimistic. I encourage people to move forward with faith, not fear. And I don't mean faith in like a religious white man in a beard looking like Rob Laurie from the sky, I'm talking about, you know, faith. Faith is the opposite to fear. Fear is just an expectation. Fear is an expectation of a crappy thing to come. Faith is the same thing, but turn the other way. And it's the expectation of a really good thing to come. So operate out of a state of faith. And we will bring about heaven on earth is my supreme mission on earth right now. And I love you guys. I'm going to turn this thing off. Yeah, I'm gonna try and catch. Gonna try and catch the doctor's words here, but I'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. We'll leave with thoughts from Janice about you know, this conversation and where we can go from here and how people can get involved.
Well, you know, I have strong feelings. I'm much like Trevor in the spiritual world, but I do think education is key. And I think we have to educate people in the terms that they understand. And one of those first is making people realize that they are spiritual beings. Most people don't realize they're spiritual beings. They don't pay attention to everything if they can't see it or touch it, they have no belief in it. So first of all, we need to lead people back to their spirituality. You are a spiritual being. You are subject to the laws of the universe, not of the patriarchal, man-created world that we see and that we do fear. We need to move away from that system. And that's a hard sell for a lot of people. What you can't see or touch or smell or taste, they won't have faith in. But we need to be able to connect them back to their bodies, back to their spirit, back to their mentality. And I do it a lot by telling patients, take your shoes off and go ground to the earth and just listen to the birds and listen to the trees. And then tell me, close your eyes and then see how much more vibrant the world is going to look. If we can convince them of things like that, we can move them to that paradigm. But we have to switch them from that old patriarchal, I know what's best for you kind of society that we all live in. And because of what we're having with social unrest, with COVID, with all the other horrible things that's going around globally, this is the time to do it. Make people believe in something different. Give them the hallucinogenic, something so they feel like they're doing something for themselves. You know, change their minds, their mentality, and this is the time to do it. So again, educate them in terms that they understand, connect them to their spirituality, and give them the tools that can show them how they can move their own story forward. And then we'll do something magical.
Wow, I agree.
Amazing. Well, thank you. That was enlightening. And I'm glad that I'm in an industry, in a space that is enlightening, that does allow us to become more conscious human beings. And that's part of what drives me as well. So thank you everyone for joining us, and keep fighting the fight. This is the only way that we change the world, and we get the information out there, and we help to change that stigma that you mentioned, because the war on drugs has been terrifically bad for the whole world, and it's our duty to start to change that.
Beautiful. What a great hour. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Nice talking and meeting all of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.
Here's Saul. Thank you to you and the team at SciTech again for bringing us all together.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, guys.